In March 2022, it was quickly becoming clear that the Russian invasion wasn't going to plan. Therefore, negotiations began to find an end to the conflict. The parties met in Istanbul in late March to mid-April, and an agreement was close to being reached. There was a willingness from both sides to achieve an end to the fighting, and they agreed on a wide range of topics. In the end, three main factors prevented an agreement from ever materializing. First was the territorial dispute over Donbass and Crimea. The negotiations largely sidestepped these contentious issues, agreeing instead to defer them to future talks after a peace deal had been signed. Notably, both sides even pledged to peacefully resolve their dispute over Crimea within the next 10 to 15 years. Second was the situation on the battlefield. At the time, Russian forces were withdrawing from the area around Kyiv, which boosted Ukrainian confidence in their ability to achieve a victory on the battlefield. Compounding this was the discovery of war crimes committed by Russian forces in Bucha, which deeply outraged the Ukrainian people and hardened public opinion against making concessions towards Moscow. Third was Western reluctance. The deal would have seen Russian forces withdraw from Ukraine, except for Donbass and Crimea, in exchange for Ukraine giving up their NATO aspirations and becoming a non-nuclear neutral state, forbidding them from ever hosting foreign troops on their soil. In exchange, the Ukrainians would get security guarantees from many countries, possibly including members of the UN Security Council, including Russia, along with Canada, Germany, Israel, Italy, Poland and Turkey. The deal would oblige the guarantors to come to Ukraine's aid if they were under attack. The Western countries, however, weren't so keen on the idea, as it would mean if Russia ever invaded again, they would have to join in the fight. They were also skeptical over the lack of resolve in the territorial questions. So, after the Ukraine saw success on the battlefield around Kyiv, the Westerners thought that Ukraine could achieve victory on the battlefield. Thus, they pressured Ukraine to withdraw from negotiations and offered to raise military aid massively. Now, over 3 years later, I think it's fair to check in on how the war and the West's relationship with Ukraine has developed and whether or not the West's Ukraine policy has been successful over the past 3 years. While during the first weeks of the invasion, Ukraine did not have a lot of Western kit, the few weapons it did have proved crucial in fighting off the initial Russian advance. The Javelin and NLAW anti-tank missiles proved effective in halting Russian armored columns, and the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles wreaked havoc on Russian aircraft and helicopters. But it was Western, particularly US intelligence, which played the more important role. The US warned Ukraine many times about an inevitable Russian invasion before it started, but the Europeans and Ukrainians remained skeptical and only started making proper preparations just weeks before the invasion. After the invasion started in late February, the scope of US intelligence sharing deepened considerably. The US, among with many things, provided real-time data about incoming Russian missiles and confirmed target coordinates per Ukrainian requests and sometimes without solidation, helping raise the cost of war for Russia. The sinking of the Moskva, for example, was enabled by highly accurate information supplied by US surveillance aircraft which had been tracking the ship for hours before the attack. It's clear that the intelligence provided by the West played a crucial role in the war, with Admiral Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, describing intelligence and training as most important forms of Western support to Ukraine in 2022. Despite all the aid provided by the West, it was ultimately the bravery of the Ukrainians and their willingness to fight which proved to be the key factors behind the successful halting of the Russian advance. Emboldened by the Russian withdrawal in the north and encouraged by Western leaders led by Boris Johnson to continue the fight, the Ukrainians withdrew from negotiations. Oleksiy Danilov, the chair of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council, said on May 2nd, quote, "A treaty with Russia is impossible. Only capitulation can be accepted." After the Ukrainian withdrawal from negotiations, the flow of military aid accelerated and became increasingly heavy. The Russian army was in a bad shape in the summer of 2022. They had suffered heavy losses to their pre-war professional army, and covert recruiting operations weren't enough to keep up with the losses. By August 2022, US intelligence reports showed that the Russians had already suffered 70,000 to 80,000 casualties. This led to an acute manpower shortage, low morale, and when combined with the ineffectiveness of the Russian command, it gave the Ukrainians a golden opportunity. As it turned out, the Ukrainians would exploit these Russian weaknesses masterfully. In September, they launched the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and in less than a month, the Ukrainians recaptured over 500 settlements and 12,000 square kilometers of territory. Western aid, intelligence sharing, and planning played a vital role in the success of the Kharkiv counteroffensive. The offensive was preceded by a propaganda campaign about an imminent offensive in Kherson Oblast, which drew away Russian forces. Additionally, the newly arrived HIMARS systems, along with the M777 howitzers, allowed the Ukrainians to strike Russian logistics and command structures behind the lines, facilitating the rapid advance. Once the Russians finally managed to stabilize the line, the Ukrainians had advanced around 100 kilometers and captured many prisoners and tons of equipment. The success in Kharkiv was soon followed by the recapture of Kherson city in November. Like in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, the Kherson offensive was also planned with the help of Western commanders who played a significant role in shaping the offensive. The Ukrainians had favored a broader offensive across the southern front, aiming at cutting the Russian land bridge to Crimea, but Western wargamers tried to simulate the attack, and they came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians lacked sufficient forces and ammunition to pull off such a large-scale operation. They therefore recommended a more limited operation to capture the city of Kherson and kick the Russians from the west bank of the Dnipro River, and the Ukrainians listened. As the Russians had sent some of their best units from Kharkiv Oblast to Kherson, the Kherson counteroffensive was sure to be far from the blitzkrieg scene in Kharkiv. The Russians had dug in well, and they weren't suffering from manpower shortages like in Kharkiv. All this meant that when the Ukrainians attacked, they faced fierce resistance and suffered large casualties. The Russians, however, had a major weakness, namely supply. The stretch of the Dnipro River they controlled only had 3 crossings. Using HIMARS, the Ukrainians swiftly rendered the Antonovsk railway and road bridges in Kherson impassable, leaving only the Novokakhovka Dam 60 kilometers to the northeast as the only remaining crossing. The Russians now had to rely on pontoon barges to get supplies over to Kherson, severely hampering their logistics. Once the Ukrainians reached within artillery range from the crossings to Kherson, Russian positions became untenable and they swiftly withdrew to the left bank of the Dnieper. Following the victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, Ukrainian morale was riding high. Victory on the battlefield seemed within reach, with Zelensky calling the liberation of Kherson, quote, the beginning of the end of the war, during his visit to Kherson on the 14th of November. At the onset of the war in 2022, Ukraine's military aid from the West primarily consisted of surplus and outdated equipment, often not aligned with Ukraine's immediate battlefield needs. This ad hoc approach led to ineffectiveness and delays in delivering critical support. To combat this issue, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, also known as the Ramstein Group, was established in April, which would eventually consist of 57 member nations. The group's primary objective was to coordinate military aid to Ukraine, ensuring that the assistance matched with Ukraine's evolving needs. The establishment of these coordination mechanisms significantly improved Ukraine's military effectiveness. While a significant improvement over the uncoordinated aid of the early weeks, the Ramstein Group was still unable to overcome Western leaders' hesitancy to send new types of equipment to Ukraine, nor could it fully address other challenges such as a shortage of artillery shells. By the end of 2022, the Ukrainians were completely reliant on aid from the West to continue the fight. While the relationship between Ukraine and the West was very good and public support for continued aid for Ukraine was still high, there were some cracks beginning to emerge. The Ukrainians often voiced their frustrations at delays in the delivery of Western aid and the West's reluctance to send new weapons systems to help the Ukrainian effort. This dynamic started already before the war, when Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Rezhnikov went to the US in November 2021. While there, he asked for the Stinger air defense missiles, only to be met by a "no, that's impossible." As it would turn out, the impossible wasn't impossible at all, as the US would start supplying Stingers to Ukraine a few weeks before the war started. This sequence of events where the Ukrainians ask for something and the West says no, only to say yes sometime later, has played out countless of times over the course of the war. The West often motivated their actions by claiming they didn't want to escalate the war, fears over sensitive technology being captured by the Russians, concerns over whether or not the Ukrainians could sustain the systems on the battlefield, or hesitancy of being the first country to provide a major weapons system. These excuses, however, seem much less credible when you take into account that the decisions were often reversed in just a few months. It is therefore easy to see why the Ukrainians got frustrated at all these delays, as they had impacts on the battlefield, with Zelensky suggesting all the way back in March and April that some allies were, quote, playing games when it came to military aid, and remarking that if only those who have been thinking for 31 days on how to hand over dozens of jets and tanks had 1% of their courage, referring to the defenders of Mariupol. Another hugely important component of the military aid provided to Ukraine was artillery shells. When the invasion started, the Ukrainians were relying on old Soviet-era artillery systems. The shells to these were no longer in production, so once they began running out, there wasn't much they could do, as they had little domestic shell production. Therefore they had to switch to Western-based 155mm artillery systems, which started arriving in mid-2022. But now the problem became the low artillery shell production in the West, which meant shell shortages for Ukraine. Ever since the Cold War, Western countries have been scaling back artillery production. Western militaries instead shifted focus from large conventional conflicts to counterinsurgencies and counter-terror operations requiring much less artillery. Especially in Europe, the defense industry was also hampered by massive cuts to defense spending, which impacted all output. Once these problems emerged, the differences between the structures of the defense industries in the West and Russia impacted how quickly they could react. The Western military-industrial complex is dominated by private corporations, and their production decisions focus on long-term profitability, market demand, and long-term government contracts. It makes them slow to ramp up production as they need government contracts as a guarantee of demand, which takes its time. The Kremlin, on the other hand, largely controls the entire Russian defense industry, allowing it to mobilize its industry, including civilian, in order to ramp up military production, which led to an overmatch in artillery in the war for the Russians. – 2022 was undoubtedly a successful year for Ukraine on the battlefield. Not only did it manage to stop the initial Russian attack on Kyiv, but with Western aid it also managed large victories in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts. In many ways, I think the end of 2022 was the high water line for Ukraine, the moment when Ukrainian power was at its peak compared to the Russians. The relationship with the West was great, and after the successful counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, the mood in Ukraine and the West was optimistic. With Western aid continuing and large amount of Ukrainian soldiers being sent to the West to undergo training, victory now seemed within grasp. But as big as the successes in Kharkiv and Kherson were, in my opinion, they played a major role in creating a falsified image of the war in the heads of many Western and Ukrainian leaders. As the saying goes, Russia is never as strong as she looks, but never as weak as she seems, and by the end of 2022, Russia did seem weak, so it was widely expected that the next Ukrainian counteroffensive would be the straw that broke the camel's back. But, as we'll soon see, the Russians were far from defeated, and they had understood the way the war was heading far better than the West and Ukraine. When the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv succeeded, it proved to the Russian command, for once and for all, that the quick victory they had been hoping for was not going to happen. The Russians were forced to confront uncomfortable realities on the battlefield and began preparing for a prolonged war of attrition. A war of attrition is force-centric, unlike a war of maneuver, which is fought with a terrain-focused mentality. This means that it's more important to preserve your own forces while grinding down the enemy than to try and capture or hold any strategically insignificant ground. This shift could be seen after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, when Putin finally decided to call a partial mobilization. It was a decision he had been holding off for a while due to the political risks it entailed. But by September, the 300,000 or so conscripts were desperately needed on the front lines in order to maintain the capabilities of the Russian forces. At the same time, Russia also moved to consolidate the gains it had already made in Ukraine by calling a referendum to join Russia. In highly dubious circumstances, to say the least, the population of the Russian-occupied parts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson unsurprisingly voted to join Russia. In October, General Sergei Surovikin was put in charge of the Russian forces in Ukraine. Surovikin was known for his involvement in the prolonged Russian military operations in Syria. During his tenure at the head of the Russian forces, they took on a more defensive approach, starting construction of a line of fortifications, minefields and trenches in the south, which would soon be known as the Surovikin Line, and would play a big role in the Ukrainian counteroffensive soon to come. Simultaneously, the Russian economy was also put on war footing, with military expenditure rising from an estimated 86.4 billion to 109 billion USD. But it would take time before the new troops would be trained, fortifications could be built, and factories could increase production. The Russians therefore needed to buy time and delay the upcoming Ukrainian offensive as much as possible. The Russians needed a distraction which would tie up the Ukrainian forces and give the Russians time to rest and refit. Therefore the Russians laid a trap in Bakhmut, and luckily for them the Ukrainians fell right into it. The Wagner PMC had started recruiting from prisons in the summer, led by its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. By the fall, the ranks of Wagner had grown into the tens of thousands. Wagner had been involved on the front in the Bakhmut area since the Battle of Popasna in April and May. By the end of the year, the Russian army had significantly toned down its involvement in the Battle of Bakhmut, and the task of capturing the city fell squarely on the Wagner group. The city of Bakhmut held little strategic importance, but Prigozhin with his loud mouth helped turn it into a symbolic city, much more important than it should ever have been. On the 7th of March, Zelensky stated that the capture of Bakhmut would provide the Russian forces with an open road to Slovyansk, Kramatorsk and other critical settlements in the Donetsk Oblast. With hindsight, we can obviously see that this wasn't the case at all, since in the 2 years since, the Russians have only advanced around 10 kilometers from Bakhmut and are still 20 kilometers short of Kramatorsk. It's easy to criticize the decision in hindsight, but the facts are that the strategic insignificance of Bakhmut was already well known at the time, and the decision to stay and fight in the city was widely questioned already back then. It raises the question, despite all this, why did the Ukrainians stay and fight so fiercely for it? The main factors driving the Ukrainian decision were twofold. The Ukrainian command believed that huge losses in Bakhmut would hamper Russia's defensive capabilities for the incoming counteroffensive. The second was symbolic. The Ukrainians had just won 2 stunning victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, therefore the initiative was firmly in their hands, and they did not want to hand it straight back to Russia by giving them an easy victory in Bakhmut. Holding Bakhmut could also increase morale, with Zelensky referring to Bakhmut as the fortress of our morale. Besides, it showed the West that the Ukrainians could still resist, even in Donbass, the most crucial area for the Russian invasion. But what the Ukrainian command seemingly didn't account for was the fact that the brunt of the Russian losses were absorbed by the Wagner group, especially their convict component. Thus, while the Wagner group got pummeled, the Russian armed forces only grew stronger during the battle, as they got a break from the fighting to train their new recruits, reorganize and build up defensive fortifications. Simultaneously, on the Ukrainian side, the forces taking part in the defense of the city were some of its best, making them much harder to replace than Russian conscripts. Therefore, when the Russian armed forces grew stronger, Ukrainians were losing some of their best soldiers in a fight for a strategically insignificant city. In short, you could say that the Battle of Bakhmut was a cleverly laid trap for the Ukrainians, one which they fell right in. It gave the illusion of causing heavy casualties to the Russians, while in fact the Russian armed forces got a much needed break from fighting, while Wagner absorbed most of the damage. Simultaneously, it caused the Ukrainians to expend significant amounts of men and material which would have been much needed for the 2023 counteroffensive. In November 2022, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, floated the idea of cutting a deal with the Russians to end the war when Ukraine was in a position of power. At the time, his comments were largely met with cries of appeasement. His comments were also rejected in Ukraine, with the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Valery Zaluzhny, stating, quote, "Our goal is to liberate all Ukrainian land from Russian occupation. We will not stop on this path under any circumstances. The Ukrainian military will not accept any negotiations, agreements or compromise decisions. There is only one condition for negotiations. Russia must leave all captured territories." The Biden administration subsequently clarified that any decision to negotiate rests solely with the Ukrainians, reaffirming continued US support for Kyiv's objectives. With Ukraine doubling down, the anticipation for the 2023 counteroffensive was high. The planning had been started all the way back in autumn 2022, and just like in Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives, the plans were created in joint wargames with the help of Western allies. The agreed-upon plan would see the main Ukrainian effort in the south to break through the Russian lines and reach the city of Melitopol at the gates of Crimea, cutting off the land bridge between Crimea and mainland Russia. The main thrust would be led by General Tarnavsky, while General Alexander Syrsky would launch a smaller, diversionary attack aimed at recapturing Bakhmut and diverting Russian forces from the main battle raging on in the south. The offensive was to be launched in the beginning of May to not allow the Russians to further reinforce their positions north of Melitopol. The winter and the spring should be spent building up the required forces for the operation. During the spring of 2023, new systems began arriving for the Ukrainian counteroffensives. Among the most important were Western-made main battle tanks, mine-clearing vehicles, along with British-made long-range Storm Shadow missiles, later joined by French Scalp missiles. For the counteroffensives, the Ukrainians had formed 12 new brigades, 9 of whom were sent to the west to receive equipment and training in NATO-styled combined arms operations, while 3 were trained and equipped domestically. According to the plan, the offensive should have been launched at the beginning of May, but the launch day came and went without any signs of an offensive. On the 11th of May, Zelensky publicly acknowledged that the counteroffensive had been delayed because they lacked enough Western equipment to succeed without incurring significant casualties. Despite delays in arms and ammunition deliveries, the Americans were adamant that the Ukrainians had enough to succeed and tried their best to pressure the Ukrainians to launch the attack. In late May, intelligence showed that the Russians were quickly building new brigades, and it became clear to the Ukrainians that they would have to go with what they had. At a meeting of the Ukrainian command, General Zaluzhny laid out the plan one last time. Then General Syrsky spoke. He was the mastermind behind the Kharkiv counteroffensive and was unhappy to play a supporting role in this one. He therefore proposed a diversion from the original plan. He would launch a full-scale attack on Bakhmut and then drive deep into Luhansk. To pull it off, he would of course need a lot more men and ammunition. Zelensky ultimately sided with Syrskyi, and soon troops and supplies meant for the Melitopol axis were heading towards Bakhmut. When the Americans got wind of this, they were understandably frustrated. To them, the Ukrainians had just handicapped their Melitopol offensive, which was their best chance of victory. This dispute created a rift between the parties, which hasn't fully healed since. When the offensive was launched in early June, the Ukrainians attacked on 3 fronts simultaneously. As the West had warned, the Ukrainians had spread their forces too thin, and the attacks quickly stalled and losses began mounting. Mistrust between the parties also significantly hampered efforts to salvage something from the campaign. In the end, the counteroffensive was a huge failure, causing a rift between Ukraine and its most important Western backers and forcing it on the back foot on the battlefield for the foreseeable future. While it would be easy to blame the failure of the offensive on the fact that the Ukrainians altered the plans last minute, it would be far from the truth. Even if the Ukrainians had followed the plans agreed upon with the West to a T, while it would certainly have helped, the offensive would probably still have ended in a failure, and the reason for that lies squarely at the feet of the West. You see, the plans for the offensive and the training the Ukrainians had received was all based on Western combined arms warfare. The Western countries' only combat experience is from fighting insurgencies with vastly inferior military capabilities. Therefore, Western plans often assume that they outgun and outpower their opponents on the battlefield. The second problem is literally in the name: combined arms. The plan would see Ukrainian forces conduct an combined arms offensive without combined arms, as the Ukrainians had no air power, something no NATO military would ever attempt. As it would turn out, Russian dominance in the air was one of the main reasons why the Ukrainian offensive stalled, with Russian attack helicopters raining down fire on advancing Ukrainians, causing heavy casualties. Once the West finally addressed some of these problems, it was already too late. In October, the Ukrainians were sent long-range ATACMS missiles for their HIMARS launchers, which allowed them to strike the bases from which the helicopters were operating, forcing them to withdraw. And finally, in July 2024, the first F-16 fighter jets arrived in Ukraine. One has to wonder if those and more capabilities had arrived in early 2023, perhaps the counteroffensive could have ended differently. You can therefore understand Zelensky's frustration when he remarked after the counteroffensive, quote, "Every decision to which we, then later everyone together comes to, is late by around 1 year." So, while the Ukrainians certainly didn't help their chances of success, the Western plan was flawed from the beginning, which would probably have caused the offensive to fail even if the plan was perfectly implemented. The most significant consequence of the 2023 counteroffensive was the growing mistrust between Ukraine and its Western backers. Alongside the battlefield setbacks, the prospect of militarily reclaiming the 2014 borders began to appear increasingly unrealistic. After the failure of the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, the grinding war of attrition continued, with Russia slowly but surely crawling forward while grinding down the Ukrainians' ability to resist. While the Russians were also undoubtedly suffering heavy casualties, the difference between Ukraine and Russia is that, unlike Ukraine, Russia can replace those losses. In January 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the Russians were enlisting over 1,000 soldiers every day, mainly driven by a large financial incentive, while at the same time the Ukrainians were struggling to replace their losses. In the US, congressional Republicans were holding up military aid to Ukraine, while at home the Ukrainians were suffering from manpower shortages. This caused the next spat between Ukraine and its Western allies, centering around conscription. To help ease the manpower issue, the Ukrainians lowered the age of conscription from 27 to 25 in April. The $61 billion aid package finally went through in April, providing relief for the Ukrainians on the front line, but the uncertainty over the future grew stronger as the US elections came nearer. The US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin heavily pressured Zelensky to lower the conscription age from 25 to 18 in order to solve the manpower issue on the front lines. Zelensky reportedly dismissed these suggestions, saying, "Why should I draft more people when we don't have equipment to give them? And your generals are reporting that your units are undermanned," Austin reportedly responded. "They don't have enough soldiers for the equipment they have." This caused a standoff between the Ukrainians, who thought that the Americans weren't willing to do what was necessary to help them prevail, while the Americans thought the Ukrainians weren't willing to do what was necessary to help themselves prevail. Taking into account Ukraine's demographic issues, Zelensky's decision not to mobilize the 18 to 25-year-olds is understandable, with him often referring to them as the fathers of the future they were fighting for. In early May, the Russians launched a new offensive crossing the border north of Kharkiv to establish some sort of buffer zone and to further stretch out the Ukrainian forces. The advance quickly stalled, but it exposed a fundamental asymmetry in the conflict. The Russians could build up and support their forces in Ukraine from across the border, and the Ukrainians could not strike back using Western equipment or intelligence. Therefore, the security on the part of the Russians was much more lax on their side of the border, as they thought the US would never give the Ukrainians permission to kill Russians with American weapons on sovereign Russian territory. It gave the Ukrainians an opportunity, and when the Russians attacked, the Biden administration decided to cross many red lines and allowed the Ukrainians for the first time to strike inside Russia with Western-made weaponry, albeit only 50 miles deep. But as we'll soon see, all the remaining red lines regarding the internationally recognized borders were soon to be put to the test. In the spring and summer, Ukrainian officials had been hinting at needing a victory. Unlike in previous years, this time the Ukrainians kept their plans secret even to their closest allies. The reason why would become clear on the 6th of August 2024. On the morning of the 6th of August, Ukrainian troops crossed the border into Russia for the first time in the conflict, armed to the teeth with Western weapons, in an attack which threw all sorts of red lines imposed by the West out of the window. Understandably, the Americans weren't too pleased, with senior Pentagon officials calling it blackmail. The Americans had given the Ukrainians permission to strike within Russia to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Kharkiv, not so that the Ukrainians could take advantage of it and seize Russian soil. The Americans could have pulled the plug on all American weapon systems and intelligence the Ukrainians were using in Kursk, but they knew that doing so would endanger the lives of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers now operating within the Kursk salient, and therefore the Americans relented. The incursion was successful early on, the Ukrainians advanced at a pace that hadn't been seen in the war for many years, thanks to the element of surprise and the lack of defenders at the border. They rapidly captured around 1,000 square kilometers along with the border town of Sudzha, but by the end of September the attack had stalled and the Russians had begun regaining ground. The attack raised many questions, chief among them why. Why did the Ukrainians launch an attack into Russia when their lines were already stretched thin and they were losing territory inside Ukraine? The main reasons why are threefold. Number 1. Diverting forces from the east of Ukraine to slow down the Russian advance from Donbass. Number 2. PR. To increase morale at home and to show the West that the Ukrainians could still win on the battlefield. Number 3. To gain a valuable card in negotiations by holding Russian territory. If we look at the operation through these goals, we can assess whether it was successful or not. Goal number 1. While the attack drew some Russian forces from Ukraine, they often came from secondary areas on the front line. In fact, the Russian advance only increased in speed in the months after the Kursk incursion, due to the fact that the Ukrainians had to divert some of their best troops to Kursk to launch the incursion in the first place. Goal number 2. The incursion gave an initial morale boost for both Ukrainian civilians and soldiers. Once the offensive stalled, however, and the Russians began regaining ground, the opinions about the offensive began to sour, with many questioning the logic behind it. While the incursion also showed that the Ukrainians could still pull off complex attacks on the battlefield, overrunning some border guards is still a far cry from breaching the Surovikin line. Once the North Koreans showed up to help the Russians in Kursk, the Biden administration finally allowed the use of attack camps and storm shadow strikes deep into Russia, which was a major victory for Ukraine. But the huge promises of aid the Ukrainians were hoping for would not come. Goal number 3. While the Ukrainians gained a sizable chunk of Russia, around 1,000 square kilometers at its peak, it was only a drop in the ocean of the over 110,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory that the Russians controlled. Therefore, the idea that the territory would make any significant difference in negotiations was wishful thinking. And a card in negotiations is only useful if you get to play it, and the Ukrainians wouldn't get the chance to. Once the Russians put significant pressure on the pocket in March, the Ukrainians crumbled, and by May they had practically been driven out of Kursk. So, while the Ukrainians got concessions out of the West in regards to using Western weaponry in Russia, it didn't significantly increase the amount of aid. Additionally, the attack breached many red lines the West had set and showed mistrust in the relationship between the Allies. In November, Donald Trump was elected as the 47th President of the United States, which brought a new era to the relationship between Ukraine and the West. On the campaign trail, Trump had said he would end the conflict in 24 hours. While that always seemed unrealistic, it was clear that he would pursue an end to the conflict. Trump had vocally criticized aid to Ukraine during his presidential campaign, so it seemed unlikely that he would approve more funding for Ukraine in his time in office. Trump's rhetoric prompted the outgoing Biden administration to approve the last $6 billion aid package and request a further $24 billion package to be approved by Congress, which it never did. In order to force the Ukrainians to the negotiation table, Trump took a confrontational attitude towards the Ukrainians, which significantly strained the relationship between the two countries. Zelensky was unwilling to take the first step towards peace by agreeing to an immediate ceasefire, with Zelensky claiming in January that a ceasefire without security guarantees would only benefit the Russians. But after the leaders had a public falling out in the Oval Office in February, Trump cut off all military aid and intelligence sharing, which caused Zelensky to finally come around and back an American proposal for a 30-day immediate ceasefire in March, leading to the US resuming aid. On this front, Trump's plan for peace can be classified as a success. But the issue of actually getting Russia to come to the table would prove much more difficult. With Russia advancing on the battlefield, Putin clearly thinks that he still has a lot to gain from continuing the war. It would therefore take an unprecedented amount of military aid to be sent to Kyiv, or huge concessions on the part of the Ukrainians to lure the Russians to the negotiation table. As Trump seems unlikely to do the former, it leaves Zelensky in a terrible position. He could agree to huge concessions to Russia, which would basically be political suicide for him, in order to get Russia to the negotiation table, where he still would have to secure believable security guarantees to prevent another Russian invasion. On the other hand, he could continue the fight and risk losing American support. While Trump's return has worsened Ukraine's relationship with the US, its relationship with Europe has grown stronger. In response to the perceived US disengagement, European nations have taken a step to bolster their support for Ukraine, and they would certainly continue supporting the war if the Ukrainians wish to continue. But the Europeans cannot replace the US, and even with European military spending on the rise, it will still take years for the effects of that spending to bring any sort of significant results. Furthermore, the Europeans have been far from trustworthy allies, with their actions falling far short of their rhetoric. Zelensky is therefore in an impossible situation. He can either commit political suicide by agreeing to massive unpopular concessions to Russia, or continue the war where the Ukrainians' outlook looks increasingly bleak. The negotiations and Trump's effect on the war is a whole other topic in and of itself, one which I don't have time to go into right now, but will certainly be a topic for a future video. Despite initial hesitation, Western powers rallied behind Ukraine with unprecedented military and financial aid, driven by both moral outrage and geopolitical self-interest. However, delays in delivering key systems, from tanks to fighter jets, often left Ukraine disadvantaged on the battlefield, fueling growing frustration in Kyiv. Zelensky's leadership evolved from pleading for more support to sharply criticizing Western indecision and highlighting the asymmetry between Ukraine's existential urgency and the West's cautious incrementalism. Over time, the relations became more strained due to setbacks on the battlefield, disagreements about strategy, and public support for Ukraine wavering, but the relations still remain good on the surface. While Trump's return to the White House has caused relations between Ukraine and the US to visibly worsen, it has also increased the resolve in Europe and brought the Europeans closer to Ukraine. In my view, the relationship between the West and Ukraine was crucial in preserving Ukrainian sovereignty by halting the initial Russian assault. Western aid kept Ukraine in the fight, but that, I believe, is also the heart of the problem. Despite bold rhetoric about Russia being a threat to all of Europe and the war being existential to the West, the actions never matched the words. The notion that the West is using Ukraine merely to weaken Russia has been frequently raised by many Russian officials, and it's often dismissed as propaganda. But when you take a closer look at the West's actual conduct in the war, the idea begins to hold some weight. The war in Ukraine reminds me of the great proxy wars of the Cold War in both Vietnam and Afghanistan. The North Vietnamese and the Mujahideen were not necessarily expected to win outright on the battlefield. Instead, they were propped up to make the war as costly as possible for the opposing side, until the costs of the war became too high economically or politically. If the West wanted the Ukrainians to win on the battlefield, why did it take a year for the first tanks to arrive, 2.5 years for modern fighter aircraft, and to this day Germany is still refusing to send long-range missiles? The reality is, if the West had truly intended on Ukraine to win decisively on the battlefield, far more could have been done. Citing red lines and concerns about escalation rings hollow when those same red lines are crossed mere weeks after being declared. Even if Western leaders believe that a full Ukrainian military victory might provoke a nuclear response or destabilize Russia into a fractured warlord-run nuclear state, they should have been honest with the Ukrainians. If they weren't going to support a total reconquest, they should have helped Ukraine negotiate from a position of power, rather than feeding the illusion of full-scale backing. The West's Plan A was clearly to provide the Ukrainians with just enough support to keep them in the fight, while hoping that sanctions and the high cost of the invasion would trigger an economic collapse or spark domestic unrest in Russia, ultimately forcing Putin to withdraw and sue for peace. Hope, however, is not a good strategy, and once it became clear that a Russian economic or political collapse wasn't imminent, the West had no plan B. Instead of forcing the Ukrainians to negotiate when they were in a position of strength, they led the Ukrainians straight into a costly war which they could not win. And with losses mounting, and the Ukrainian positions on the battlefield and at the negotiation table worsening every day, it is hard for me to see the Western policy towards Ukraine as much more than a huge failure, and their relationship as highly manipulative on the part of the West. But then again, I'm just an idiot on the internet, so what do I know?